There's a mathematical certainty in history that most people never see. It's not about wars or revolutions or economic crashes. It's about a pattern. A sequence so precise that it has repeated 3 times in the last 150 years with terrifying accuracy. The Ottoman Empire collapsed in 42 years, the British Empire in 52 years, the Soviet Union in just 11 years, with the final death spiral taking only 900 days. 3 empires, 3 different centuries, 3 completely different political systems. But the exact same 4-stage collapse sequence: peak dominance, overextension, peripheral losses, core collapse. And here's what should terrify you. The pattern doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about military strength. It doesn't care about nuclear weapons or global trade or technological superiority. The pattern is structural, mathematical. And once an empire enters stage 3, history says then comes fast, brutally, and without mercy. Right now in 2025, we're watching this pattern play out again, but this time, the empire in question is the United States. And if the pattern holds, if history repeats the way it has 3 times before, we're not talking about collapse in 100 years or 50 years. We're talking about a timeline that could make the Soviet Union's 11-year collapse look slow. This is the story of how empires actually die. Not the myths, not the propaganda, but the cold mathematical reality of what happens when the 4-stage sequence begins. Because understanding this pattern isn't about predicting some distant future. It's about recognizing that we're already deep inside the sequence right now. And if you understand what happened to the Ottomans, the British, and the Soviets, you'll understand exactly where America is headed and how fast it's going to happen. Before we go deeper into this, I need you to do something. If this video is opening your eyes to a pattern you've never seen before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming. And here's what I really want to know. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your location right now. Because this pattern is playing out globally, and I want to see how many people around the world are waking up to what's actually happening. Now let's dive into the pattern. Before I show you the 3 empires, you need to understand why modern collapse happens so fast and why comparing everything to Rome is completely wrong. Everyone knows Rome fell, but what most people don't know is that Rome took over 200 years to collapse. From the crisis of the 3rd century around to 35 AD to the final fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Rome declined gradually, slowly, almost peacefully in some regions. Provinces were lost, reconquered, lost again. Emperors came and went. The currency debased slowly over generations. Rome fell the way a tree rots from the inside, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day it finally topples over. But modern empires don't work like Rome. They can't. And the reason is technology. Rome was pre-modern. Communication moved at the speed of a horse, maybe 50 miles a day on good roads. When a distant province rebelled, it took weeks or months for Rome to even hear about it. Then it took months more to march legions to respond. Economic integration was limited. A financial crisis in one province didn't instantly crash markets across the empire. Rome could lose territory on one frontier while maintaining control elsewhere because information, money, and military force all moved at the speed of horses and sailing ships. Modern empires are the opposite. They're built on instantaneous communication, rapid military deployment, and most importantly, total financial integration. When a modern empire starts to collapse, information spreads instantly. Markets react in milliseconds. Allies make decisions in days, not years. The collapse cascades across the entire system before the imperial center can even respond. This is why the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 42 years. Why the British Empire collapsed in 52 years. Why the Soviet Union collapsed in 11 years. Modern empires don't decline gradually. They hold together, appearing completely stable, right up until the moment they fracture completely. And that fracturing follows the exact same 4-stage pattern every single time. Let me break down the pattern before we see it play out in real history. Stage 1 is peak dominance. The empire controls vast territories. It deploys military force globally. It dominates trade routes and sets the rules for international order. Everyone pays tribute, either literally through colonies or indirectly through trade arrangements that favor the empire. The currency is accepted everywhere. The military wins every major war. And most importantly, everyone, including the empire itself, believes the empire is permanent, eternal, and shakable. Stage 2 is overextension. The empire has taken on too many commitments, military bases everywhere, allies that demand protection, trade routes that must be secured, enemies on multiple fronts. But here's the critical point. The costs now exceed the revenues. The empire is borrowing to maintain its position. The military is spread so thin that it can't respond to every challenge simultaneously. And the enemies, seeing the weakness, start testing the empire's resolve. Stage 3 is peripheral losses. This is when the collapse becomes visible. Allies start hedging their bets, making deals with rivals, colonies or satellite states break away. Trade arrangements shift to favor other powers. The currency loses its privileged status in some regions. The empire fights desperately to maintain control, but each fight drains resources and reveals more weakness. And here's the key: once the first peripheral territory breaks away successfully, others follow rapidly because the imperial mystique is broken. Stage 4 is core collapse. This is the end. Not gradual decline, not managed transition, but sudden, catastrophic implosion. The financial system breaks. The military can't be funded. The government loses legitimacy and control. And the empire that seemed unshakable just months earlier ceases to exist as a coherent entity. Now let me show you exactly how this played out 3 times, starting with the Ottoman Empire in 1880. In 1880, the Ottoman Empire was still one of the great powers of Europe. It had existed for over 600 years. The Sultan ruled from Istanbul, and his domain stretched from the Balkans in Europe through the Middle East to North Africa. The empire controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers, about twice the size of modern Iran. It had a large military, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and control over some of the most strategic territory on earth. This was stage 1, peak dominance. The Ottomans controlled the land routes between Europe and Asia. They controlled access to the Black Sea. They held the holy cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The empire seemed as permanent as the mountains. The dynasty had ruled for 6 centuries. Why would it end now? But beneath the surface, the rot was total. The empire was bankrupt. Decades of borrowing from European banks had created debts that couldn't be repaid. In 1876, the Ottoman government had defaulted on its external debt. And now European creditors literally controlled Turkish finances through something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Foreign bankers were collecting tax revenues before the Ottoman government even saw them. The military was completely outdated, while European powers had modernized their armies with railroads, telegraphs, and industrial production. The Ottomans were still fighting with tactics from the Napoleonic era. They'd lost wars to Russia repeatedly. They'd already lost control of Greece, Serbia, and Romania in the 19th century. The empire that once threatened Vienna was now called the sick man of Europe, and the population was restless. The empire was multi-ethnic: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs. And as nationalism spread across Europe, all of these groups wanted independence. The central government in Istanbul was trying to hold together an empire where huge portions of the population no longer wanted to be part of it. This was stage 2, overextension. The empire had commitments it couldn't afford, territories it couldn't defend, and debts it couldn't repay. Something had to break. In 1908, it did. A group of reformist military officers called the Young Turks staged a revolution. They forced the Sultan to restore the constitution and establish a parliament. This wasn't a takeover by foreign enemies. This was the empire's own military saying the current system was broken and imposing reform by force. The Young Turk Revolution should have been a moment of renewal, a chance to modernize and save the empire. Instead, it revealed how weak the center had become. If junior military officers could force constitutional change on the Sultan, how much real authority did Istanbul actually have? The answer became clear immediately. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia. In 1908, Bulgaria declared full independence. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya, one of the Ottoman Empire's last North African territories. The vultures were circling, and they could smell death. Then came the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. This was stage 3, peripheral losses, and they happened with shocking speed. In 1912, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro formed an alliance and attacked the Ottoman Empire. The goal was simple: seize the remaining Ottoman territory in the Balkans. The war was brutal and fast. In just 8 months, the Ottoman Empire lost 83% of its European territory and 69% of its European population. Cities that had been Ottoman for 500 years were gone overnight. Thessaloniki, Adrianople, vast swaths of Macedonia and Albania, all lost. The financial cost was staggering. The empire had to resettle hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fleeing the Balkans. The economy, already on life support, was pushed to the breaking point. And the military, which was supposed to be the backbone of the empire, had been humiliated by a coalition of small Balkan states. The empire tried to recover. The Young Turks consolidated power, purged political opponents, and attempted reform. But then they made a catastrophic decision that would doom the empire completely. In 1914, World War I began, and the Ottoman Empire had a choice: stay neutral and try to rebuild, or pick a side and gamble everything on the outcome. The Young Turk leadership chose to ally with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. This was the decision that sealed the empire's fate. The Ottomans entered the war in November 1914. For the next 4 years, they fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. Against Russia in the Caucasus, against Britain in Mesopotamia and Palestine, against British and Anzac forces at Gallipoli. The empire was already overextended. Now it was fighting a world war it couldn't possibly win. The casualties were horrific. Over 2.8 million Ottoman subjects served in the military during World War I, 725,000 died, another 400,000 were wounded. These losses came from a total population of only 23 million. The empire bled out its young men in a war it couldn't win. By 1918, the war was lost. Germany surrendered in November. The Ottoman government collapsed. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, and the victorious powers, Britain and France, began carving up the Ottoman Empire like a Christmas turkey. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was designed to erase the empire permanently. It reduced Turkey to a tiny territory in central Anatolia. It gave eastern Anatolia to an Armenian state. It gave southern Anatolia to France. It gave the Aegean coast to Greece. It placed Istanbul and the Straits under international control. The Ottoman Empire was to be wiped off the map completely. This should have been stage 4, core collapse. But something unexpected happened. A Turkish general named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, refused to accept the treaty. He organized a nationalist resistance in Anatolia, and from 1919 to 1922, Turkish nationalist forces fought against Greek, French, and Armenian forces occupying Turkish territory. Against all odds, they won. By 1922, the Turkish nationalists had expelled the occupying forces and abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. On November 1, 1922, the Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist after 623 years. It was replaced by the Republic of Turkey, a secular nationalist state that rejected the entire imperial system, from peak dominance in 1880. To complete dissolution in 1922, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 42 years. And most of that collapse happened in the final decade, from 1912 to 1922, when the Balkan Wars, World War I, and the Turkish War of Independence destroyed what remained. The lesson is this: an empire can appear stable, can even still legally exist, right up until the moment it disappears completely. The Ottomans lost the Balkans in 1912 and 1913. They lost World War I in 1918. But the empire still existed on paper until 1922. And then suddenly, it was gone. Now let's jump forward 36 years to the next great empire to collapse, the British. In 1918, at the end of World War I, the British Empire was the largest empire in human history. It controlled 35.5 million square kilometers, roughly 24% of Earth's land surface. It ruled over 500 million people, about a quarter of the world's population at the time. The sun literally never set on British territory because the empire stretched across every time zone on the plan. This was stage 1, peak dominance. Britain controlled India. The crown jewel of the empire, it controlled strategic choke points like the Suez Canal, the Straits of Gibraltar, Singapore, and the Cape of Good Hope. It dominated global trade through the pound sterling, the world's reserve currency, and the Royal Navy ruled the seas without challenge. The British believed their empire was permanent. Rudyard Kipling wrote about the white man's burden. Winston Churchill said the empire would last for 1,000 years. Britain had fought and won World War I. Surely this proved British dominance was unshakable. But World War I had destroyed Britain financially. This was the beginning of Stage 2, overextension. Before 1914, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. British banks loaned money to governments around the world. British capital financed railroads, factories, and mines on 6 continents. Britain was rich, and the empire made it richer. World War I reversed everything. The war cost Britain over £4 billion, equivalent to roughly $1 trillion in today's money. To pay for the war, Britain borrowed massively, mostly from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America over £4 billion, more than Britain's entire annual GDP. Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor in just 4 years. The economic foundation of the empire had collapsed, but the empire itself remained, for now. The 1920s were a brief period of apparent stability. Britain still controlled the empire. The pound was still the reserve currency. The Royal Navy still patrolled the seas. But underneath, the cracks were spreading. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound, which had been as good as gold for over a century, was suddenly just paper backed by nothing but confidence. It immediately lost 25% of its value. This was a signal to the world. Britain could no longer maintain its commitments. The empire was breaking. Then came World War II, and this was the event that made Stage 3 inevitable. World War II started in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war. For the next 6 years, Britain fought for its survival. The cost was catastrophic. World War II cost Britain another £120 billion in current terms. Britain borrowed even more from America. By 1945, Britain's debt to the United States exceeded Britain's entire GDP. The empire had survived. Britain was on the winning side, but the cost of victory was the empire itself. In 1945, Britain was bankrupt. The country couldn't even feed its own population. Rationing continued until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Britain had to get a massive loan from the United States just to avoid default. And the terms of that loan were crystal clear. America would support Britain economically, but Britain would have to start dismantling the empire. Stage 3, peripheral losses, and they happened with shocking speed. In 1947, Britain gave up India. This was the crown jewel, the source of wealth, manpower, and prestige for nearly 200 years. India, Pakistan, and Burma all became independent. Britain tried to make it seem like a managed transition, but the reality was simple. Britain couldn't afford to hold India anymore. The cost of administration, defense, and dealing with the independence movement was too high. Losing India shattered the imperial mystique completely. If Britain couldn't hold India, could it hold anything? The answer became clear in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. This was the moment when Britain learned it was no longer a great power. It was America's junior partner. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by Britain and France. The canal was strategically vital, Britain's lifeline to its remaining Asian territories. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to retake the canal. The military operation succeeded. British and French forces occupied the canal zone. But then the United States ordered Britain to withdraw. President Eisenhower was furious that Britain had acted without American approval. The United States threatened to dump British bonds and destroy the pound. Britain had no choice. Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered a withdrawal. British forces left in humiliation. The message was unmistakable. Britain could no longer conduct independent military operations. British foreign policy now required American permission. The empire was over in everything but name, from 1956 to 1970. The rest of the empire collapsed in a cascade. Ghana independent in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, the Caribbean colonies throughout the 1960s. Even tiny islands that nobody wanted, everyone was getting out. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books and a few scattered territories too small or too poor for independence. From peak dominance in 1918 to effective dissolution in 1970, the British Empire collapsed in 52 years. And most of that collapse happened after 1945. In just 25 years, the largest empire in human history went from ruling a quarter of the world to ruling scattered islands. One generation. Stage for core collapse happened more slowly for Britain than for the Ottomans because Britain was the imperial center, not just the empire itself. Turkey could replace the Ottoman Empire as a nation-state. But there was no Britain without the empire. Instead of disappearing, Britain declined into a second-rate power, economically dependent on America, politically irrelevant on the world stage. The lesson of the British collapse is this. Empires built on economic dominance fall when the economics no longer work. Britain lost the empire because it couldn't afford to keep it. Once the money runs out, military force means absolutely nothing. Now let's look at the most recent collapse, the fastest, and the most relevant to understanding what's happening right now. The Soviet Union. In 1980, the Soviet Union was a superpower. It had nuclear parity with the United States, roughly 30,000 nuclear warheads. It controlled Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. It had allies and client states on every continent. Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, Syria, Nicaragua. The Soviet military had 5 million active personnel and the largest tank force on Earth. This was stage 1, peak dominance. The Soviet Union had achieved what Tsarist Russia never could. It was a true global power, not just a regional empire. Soviet ideology, communism, was spreading. Soviet military advisors were training insurgents and governments on 6 continents. And Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev believed the correlation of forces was shifting in favor of socialism. The Soviet Union seemed permanent. It had survived the Russian Civil War, World War II, the entire Cold War. It had launched the first satellite and the first man into space. It had built a massive industrial base. Why would it collapse now? But stage 2 had already begun, overextension, and the catalyst was Afghanistan. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government that was losing a civil war against Islamist insurgents. Soviet leaders believed it would be a quick operation. Stabilize the government, withdraw in a few months. It became a decade-long disaster. The Soviets sent over 600,000 troops to Afghanistan over 10 years. They lost 15,000 soldiers killed and 53,000 wounded. The war cost billions of dollars that the Soviet economy, already stagnating, couldn't afford, and the Soviets couldn't win. Afghan insurgents, funded by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, turned Afghanistan into the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The Afghan War revealed something critical. The Soviet military, which looked so powerful on paper, couldn't defeat lightly armed insurgents in the mountains. If the Soviets couldn't pacify Afghanistan, a country right on their border, how could they possibly maintain control over Eastern Europe, or fight NATO, or project power globally? By 1985, the Soviet economy was in full crisis. Oil prices, which had been high in the 1970s, collapsed in the 1980s. The Soviet Union depended on oil exports for hard currency. When oil prices fell from $35 per barrel in 1980 to $10 per barrel in 1986, Soviet revenues collapsed. The Soviet Union was spending 15 to 20% of GDP on the military, trying to match American defense spending. But the Soviet economy was a fraction of the size of the American economy. The Soviets were trying to compete militarily with an economy that couldn't support the burden. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. He understood the system was broken. He tried to reform through glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. But reform in a totalitarian system is incredibly dangerous because once you start allowing dissent, you can't control where it goes. Stage 3. Peripheral losses. And they came faster than anyone expected. In 1989, Gorbachev made a decision that would destroy the Soviet Empire. He told the leaders of Eastern European communist governments that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to keep them in power. For 40 years, the Soviet military had been the guarantee that kept communist governments in control. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviets had invaded to crush any threat to communist rule. But in 1989, Gorbachev said no more invasions. Eastern Europe was on its own. The effect was immediate. In Poland, the Solidarity Movement, a trade union that had been fighting the communist government for years, negotiated for partially free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won overwhelmingly. Poland's communist government collapsed. In Hungary, the government opened its border with Austria in May 1989. East Germans, who were forbidden to travel to the West, started fleeing to Hungary and then crossing into Austria to reach West Germany. Thousands fled. In October 1989, mass protests erupted in East Germany. Hundreds of thousands of people in Leipzig, Berlin, and other cities demanded freedom and an end to communist rule. The East German government could have sent in the military, but they looked to Moscow for support, and Moscow said no. On November 9, 1989, a confused East German official announced that the border with West Germany would be opened. Immediately, crowds surged to the Berlin Wall. Border guards, receiving no orders to stop them, let them through. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Iron Curtain, fell in one night. Over the next month, the communist governments of Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all collapsed. Romania's dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was executed on Christmas Day, 1989. By the end of the year, every communist government in Eastern Europe was gone except Yugoslavia and Albania. From June to December 1989, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe collapsed in 6 months. Territory that the Soviets had controlled for 45 years was gone in half a year, and this triggered Stage 4, core collapse. The Soviet Union itself started fracturing. If Poland, Hungary, and East Germany could leave the Soviet sphere, why couldn't the Soviet republics themselves leave? In 1990, Lithuania declared independence. Estonia and Latvia followed. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup to stop the dissolution. It failed in 3 days because the military wouldn't support it. After the failed coup, the Soviet Union disintegrated rapidly. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The next day, the USSR was formally dissolved. From the Berlin Wall falling on November 9, 1989 to the USSR's dissolution on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Empire collapsed in 900 days. Superpower to nothing in less than 3 years. The lesson is devastating. The end comes faster than anyone predicts. When an empire loses legitimacy, when the periphery breaks away, the collapse is sudden and total. 3 empires, same pattern. Peak dominance, Overextension, peripheral losses, core collapse. Ottomans, 42 years. British, 52 years. Soviets, 11 years with a 900-day endgame. And now the United States in 2025. In 1991, the United States became the sole superpower. Stage 1, peak dominance. Military bases in over 100 countries. The dollar as the global reserve currency, economically and militarily untouchable. Then we overextended. In 2001, we invaded Afghanistan. In 2003, Iraq. Stage 2, overextension. The wars cost over $8 trillion. In August 2021, we withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years. The Taliban took over in a week. It was a humiliating defeat broadcast globally. We currently have 750 military bases in 80 countries. Our defense budget is $850 billion annually, but we're committed to defending NATO, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other allies. We cannot fulfill all these commitments simultaneously if they're all tested at once. The United States owes $36 trillion in debt. That's 123% of GDP. We're borrowing $2 trillion per year just to keep the government running. Interest on the debt is approaching $1 trillion annually. And now we're in stage 3, peripheral losses. In 2024, Saudi Arabia signaled a historic shift away from the petrodollar system that has existed since the 1970s. For 5 decades, Saudi Arabia sold oil exclusively in US dollars by choice, creating massive global dollar demand. Now Saudi Arabia is actively moving toward accepting multiple currencies for oil sales, including the Chinese yuan, euros, and others. This isn't the end of a formal treaty. It's something more significant. The voluntary abandonment of a system that has anchored dollar dominance for half a century. Saudi Arabia is hedging, building relationships with China, Russia, and BRICS. Turkey, supposedly a NATO member, bought Russian missiles despite American protests. Turkey is now talking about joining BRICS. Turkey no longer follows American leadership unconditionally. BRICS itself is rapidly expanding. 6 new members joined in 2024, including Saudi Arabia and UAE. Over 40 countries have expressed interest in joining. BRICS now represents 36% of global GDP. Larger than the G7, and they're actively building alternative financial systems designed specifically to bypass the dollar. This is stage 3, allies hedging, alternative systems emerging. Dollar dominance eroding. We are in stage 3 right now, and history says stage 4 comes next. Faster than anyone expects. What would stage 4 look like for America? The dollar's role as reserve currency is what allows us to borrow $2 trillion per year without triggering hyperinflation. Other countries need our currency, so they buy our debt. But if the petrodollar system is dead, if BRICS countries start trading in local currencies, if central banks start dumping dollar reserves, all those dollars flood back to America. That triggers massive inflation. What costs $100 today could cost $300 within a year. Foreign buyers of treasury bonds disappear. Interest rates spike to attract buyers. The government faces 3 choices: default on the debt, cut spending massively, or print money to pay obligations. All 3 options destroy the economy. Default means the financial system collapses, banks fail, pensions evaporate. Cutting spending means slashing Social Security, Medicare, defense. That triggers political chaos, possibly civil unrest. Printing money causes hyperinflation that destroys the currency. Your savings evaporate. Any path leads to stage 4. Core collapse. The military can't be funded at current levels. The 750 overseas bases can't be maintained. Allies get abandoned. Treaty commitments get broken. The American security umbrella that has covered half the planet for 80 years disappears. The collapse doesn't mean America disappears as a country. Turkey survived the Ottoman collapse. Britain survived losing the empire. Russia survived the Soviet collapse. But what emerges is a severely diminished, economically damaged nation that no longer sets the rules for the global system. And this could happen in 10 years, 5 years, maybe less. Why might the American collapse happen even faster than the Soviet collapse? The Soviet economy was relatively isolated. When it collapsed, it didn't trigger a global financial crisis. But the American empire is completely integrated into the global financial system. The dollar is the reserve currency. U.S. Treasury bonds are held by every major country. When the American empire collapses, it takes the global financial system down with it. That creates a feedback loop that accelerates the collapse exponentially. The Soviets collapsed in 900 days. America could collapse even faster because modern financial systems move at the speed of light. The cascade could happen in months, not years. And here's the final factor. We've spent the last 25 years systematically antagonizing every major rival. We expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders. We've sanctioned Russia, China, and Iran, over a third of the world's GDP. We've weaponized the dollar as a tool of foreign policy. We've essentially created the coalition that wants to see us fail. And now they're actively building the alternative systems to make it happen. The British Empire collapsed because of bankruptcy. The Soviet Empire collapsed because of economic stagnation and loss of legitimacy. The American empire faces both simultaneously. 36 trillion in debt, losing legitimacy globally because we can't win wars, can't maintain order, can't keep allies in line. 3 empires, same pattern. The Ottomans lost the Balkans, finished within a decade. The British lost India, finished within 25 years. The Soviets lost Eastern Europe, finished within 900 days. America lost Afghanistan in humiliating retreat. We're losing the petrodollar system. We're losing allies to hedging and rival alliances. We're losing the ability to finance our empire. We're in Stage 3. History says Stage 4 comes next, fast and brutal. Maybe we can reform. Maybe we can cut our commitments, balance the budget, manage a controlled decline. Maybe America can be the first empire to decline gracefully without catastrophic collapse. But the pattern says otherwise. 3 empires thought they were exceptional. All 3 collapsed in less than 50 years following the exact same sequence. If this video opened your eyes to where the American empire actually is in the historical cycle, subscribe right now. Because when Stage 4 begins, when the dollar loses reserve status, when the core starts to collapse, you're going to want to understand what's happening and why. The pattern is clear. The math is inevitable. The only question left is timing. And history says the end comes faster than anyone expects. The collapse is never gradual. It's always sudden, and it always catches the empire by surprise because right up until the end, everyone inside the empire believes they're different, that the rules don't apply to them, that their empire is eternal. That's what the Ottomans believed. That's what the British believed. That's what the Soviets believed. And that's exactly what Americans believe right now. The pattern doesn't lie. And the pattern says we're running out of time.